Hey friends, tonight's story was written just for you. Using history, imagination to help you relax. Part 1. The door he never let me open. Hello, my name is Margaret Hale. I'm 64, and until last spring, I thought I knew the man I'd been married to for over 40 years. We met when I was just 22, fresh out of nursing school. Too stubborn to be scared of anything, and far too in love with a man who spoke softly, fixed broken things with his hands, and never let me pump my own gas. His name was Richard. Everyone called him Rick. He had this laugh that made strangers turn their heads in restaurants, a deep, rumbling, genuine sound, and I would have sworn on a stack of Bibles that I knew everything about him. His habits, his moods, the way he always tapped the side of his coffee mug twice before taking a sip, the way he always whistled the same off-key tune while shaving, the way he locked the garage, always, even when we lived in the middle of nowhere and the only things out there were deer and dust. Just a habit, he'd say. Tools cost money. I never questioned it. I never even had a reason to, until the morning after his funeral, when the locksmith handed me the small, tarnished key and said Rick had left it for me in his will. Just one line, for Margaret, in case I'm not around to explain. That key opened the door to the garage, the door I had never once set foot behind, and what I found inside still keeps me up at night. I held the key in my palm for over an hour before I even stood up. The weight of it. It wasn't just metal. It was every unanswered question I'd never thought to ask. Every time I'd ignored the slight tension in Rick's voice when I wandered too close to the garage door. Every moment I'd chosen to trust him because that's what love was supposed to look like. I walked out to the driveway barefoot. The morning sun hadn't warmed the concrete yet, and it felt like ice beneath my feet. I stood in front of that garage door, a plain gray slab with a rusting handle, and realized I had no idea what I expected to find. Tools, probably. Old car parts. Maybe something sentimental. Instead, I felt something shift the second the lock turned. Like air being sucked out of the world. The door creaked open slowly, and I remember thinking it sounded like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, it was dark, not empty, not dusty, just untouched. Shelves lined the walls, neatly organized with bins and boxes. A single workbench stretched along the back wall, and in the center of the room, under a tarp, was a car. I hadn't seen that car in nearly 30 years. A 1972 Pontiac Lemons, sky blue, with a dented fender Rick had always said was beyond repair. Sold it to a buddy back in '94, he'd told me. But there it was, just sitting there, silent, waiting. I stepped inside and pulled the tarp back slowly. The paint was pristine, not a scratch. Not a speck of dust. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something else, old cologne maybe, familiar and jarring all at once. I sat in the driver's seat, the key still clutched in my hand. That's when I saw the glove box, slightly ajar, like someone had opened it recently. I reached over and tugged it open fully, and there, inside, was a stack of envelopes, all addressed in Rick's handwriting, but none of them were for me. Not one. Different names, different addresses, some local, some out of state. I flipped through them, my fingers trembling, and then I saw the postmark. 2003, 2007, 2011, 2018, the most recent one. 2 months before he died. That's when my heart started racing, because Rick had been sick for a long time. He hadn't driven anywhere in almost a year. He couldn't even make it down the stairs without help. So how in God's name had these letters gotten here? And who were they for? I took the most recent envelope and held it up to the light. The name on the front was Elliot M. Carr. I didn't know the name. Not a friend. Not a neighbor. Not a relative. At least not one I could remember. And yet, I knew that handwriting, like the back of my hand. I'd watched him write Christmas cards with that same steady penmanship. I'd read love notes on napkins with that same R that always dipped low. I should have stopped. Should have put it all back and walked away. But something had cracked open inside me. I wasn't just curious anymore. I was scared. I was angry. I was about to learn who my husband really was. And part of me already knew. I wasn't going to like it. I took the letter inside and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Rick used to read the paper every Sunday morning with his coffee and toast. And I stared at that name again, Elliot M. Carr. It sounded made up, like something from a novel or a TV show. But the envelope felt real. The kind of thick paper Rick used only when he wanted something to feel official. I didn't open it. Not yet. I Googled the name first. Nothing. No obituaries. No social media. No addresses. I tried our town registry and found nothing. And yet, Rick had sent him letters for years. I looked at the postmark again. It was from a small town about 3 hours away, a place called Wakefield Ridge. I'd never heard of it, but it had a post office, apparently. I sat back and tried to make sense of it. If he'd sold the car, why keep it hidden? If he hadn't sold it, why lie? And if he'd been sending letters to a man in Wakefield Ridge, who the hell was he? And why didn't I know about him after 4 decades of marriage? I spent the rest of that day in a fog, walking from room to room like the walls had changed when I wasn't looking. I found myself looking at old pictures, our wedding, the first house, birthdays, cookouts, searching for something that had always been there but I hadn't noticed. A shadow behind his smile, a detail in the background. But there was nothing. Rick looked the same in every photo. Kind, calm, devoted. A man who could fix a motor or a broken shelf or a loose step without complaint. A man who rubbed my feet when I worked a long shift at the hospital. A man who never raised his voice, never broke a plate, never forgot our anniversary. But now, I couldn't stop asking myself, what else had he never forgotten? What else had he never told me? I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I sat in the den with a blanket over my shoulders and that one letter in my lap. Unopened, unread, ticking like a clock. I watched the sunrise through the back windows and I swear I heard Rick's voice in my head. You're thinking too much again, Marge. But I wasn't thinking too much. I wasn't thinking enough. Because what I did the next morning wasn't logical. It wasn't cautious. And it definitely wasn't the kind of thing the old me would have done. I got in my car, printed the directions, and drove to Wakefield Ridge. Wakefield Ridge wasn't on any major highway. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked. A town where the gas station doubled as a post office and the church bulletin board served as the town calendar. The roads narrowed into cracked lanes hemmed in by leaning fences and tall grass, and the houses looked like they'd been built a century ago and then forgotten. I parked beside a diner called the Fork and Bell and sat for a minute, watching the wind twist through the dry trees. No one was around, but a few porch lights were still on. Even though the sun was high, I stepped inside the diner, and it was like walking into someone else's memory. Formica booths, faded menu boards, the smell of burnt coffee, and bacon that had been sitting too long. The woman behind the counter looked up, gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and asked, "Just passing through?" I nodded. "Actually, I'm looking for someone. Elliot M. Carr." She blinked at the name, then leaned back. Slightly. "You a relative?" "No. Just my husband used to write to him. I found something after he passed." She was silent for a moment too long. Then she said, "Well, that's a name I haven't heard in a while." That while stretched between us like a thread pulled tight. "Does he still live here?" I asked. She hesitated, then motioned toward the back. "Ask Ray. He used to deliver for the post office before he retired." Ray was sitting alone at a corner booth, slowly stirring cream into a chipped mug. He looked up as I approached, and before I even spoke, he said, "You're Margaret, aren't you?" I froze. "How do you?" "He used to talk about you. Not often, but when he did, it was careful, like he was holding something too fragile to touch." "Elliot," I whispered. Ray nodded. "He didn't live here. Not exactly. He stayed outside town, rented a little place by the edge of the woods. Never gave a return address. But he picked up letters every second Thursday. Always alone. Always quiet. And now, he hasn't come in almost a year." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Do you know where the cabin is?" Ray didn't speak right away. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too many winters, too many secrets. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a pencil-drawn map on the back of an old diner. "Receipt. Take the old logging road. About 4 miles up. You'll see a break in the trees." I took the map with trembling hands. Why did Rick never tell me about him? Ray just shook his head. "That's not a question I can answer. But if you're going up there, just be ready. That place doesn't give up its quiet easily." I drove the road he described, dust kicking up behind my tires, heart pounding with every mile. And when I reached the clearing and stepped out of the car, I saw it. A one-room cabin, half swallowed by trees, the windows dark, the mailbox rusted shut. But it was there, real, and I was standing in the middle of a truth I never asked for. I opened the creaking front door, and what I found inside wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. But it changed everything. And written on the back, in Rick's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that turned my world to dust. "For Elliot, your father always loved you." Margaret thought she buried her husband with all their shared truths. But that cabin held more than a memory. It held a name she'd never heard, a child she never knew existed, and a silence that had lasted decades. But this is only the beginning, because the cabin wasn't empty, and someone knew she was coming. Part 2. He never said he had a son. I didn't cry. Not right away. I stood there in that doorway with the photograph in my hand, the trees whispering outside and the smell of old wood thickened my lungs, and I just stared. Rick, holding a baby, smiling in a way I'd never seen. Not with me. Not with anyone. A kind of open joy I didn't recognize, like I'd stumbled into someone else's life entirely. My fingers trembled as I turned the photo back over, rereading those words again and again. "For Elliot, your father always loved you." My throat tightened. The room was still, too still. No hum from a fridge, no ticking clock, no wind slipping through the windows. Just silence. I stepped inside, slowly, like I was breaking into something sacred. The cabin was small. One room with a bed, a table, a worn armchair by a wood stove. There were books stacked neatly along the windowsill, a pair of men's boots by the door, and a mug with a dried tea ring still on the table. It looked lived in, familiar, like someone had only just stepped outside. But there was dust on everything. Not enough to say it had been abandoned for years, but enough to say no one had been back in weeks, maybe months. I searched with slow, deliberate steps. I didn't know what I was looking for. Another photograph, maybe. A name, a letter, proof, something to explain what I had just read. And I found it. In a drawer under the bed, a showbox, rubber banded shut, filled with letters, dozens of them, some in Rick's handwriting, some in another, and at the very bottom, a birth certificate. The name, Elliot Marcus Carr. Mother, Danielle Carr. Father, Richard Hale. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt the air leave my lungs. He didn't just have a son. He had a whole life. Another woman. A child. Years of letters. Pictures. A second home hidden in the woods. And not a single word to me. Not in 40 years. I felt something sharp rise in my chest. Betrayal, grief, shame, rage. All tangled into something unnameable. And beneath it, a terrifying question. Did he love me less because he loved them too? Or worse, did he love me at all? I left the cabin with the box clutched against my chest, the photograph tucked inside, and I drove back to town like a ghost. I didn't stop. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. Back home, I laid everything out on the kitchen table. Every letter, every photo. I read until the sun disappeared, until the porch light flicked on automatically, until my eyes burned. The letters told a story I hadn't lived through, a story of missed birthdays, monthly visits, late-night calls from payphones, promises made and broken and made again. Rick had never left us. He'd built to lives, and he'd kept them perfectly separate, until now. The next morning, I called the number again. This time, I left a message. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was tight, small, like it belonged to someone much younger or much older, someone drowning under too much truth. Hello, my name is Margaret Hale. My husband was Richard Hale. I believe you knew him. I found your name in a letter he left behind. I'm not looking for trouble. I just need to understand. I hung up before I could say more. I sat by the phone for 2 days. Every knock on the door made my heart stutter. Every unknown number that rang made my hands shake. Then, late Thursday afternoon, the phone rang again. No name, just a number. I answered on the first ring. Margaret? The voice was low, careful, older than I expected. Yes, I said. This is Danielle. Silence pressed between us. You found the cabin. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard. Yes. She exhaled slowly, like someone who had been holding their breath for 20 years. I always wondered if he'd tell you. He didn't. Another long pause. Then you deserve the truth. But not over the phone. She gave me an address. Not in Wakefield Ridge, but in a small town a few counties over. There's a cafe near the river. I'll meet you there. I won't run. I've done enough running. That night I packed a small bag, just in case. I barely slept. I kept thinking of all the ways this could break me further. But I had to go. I had to know. The next morning, I drove again, past fields and silent farms and rusting mailboxes. With peeling paint, I found the cafe. I found the river. And I found her. sitting alone in a booth by the window, nursing a coffee, looking exactly like someone who had carried a secret too long. She looked up when I walked in. Our eyes met, and for a second, there was no anger, no fear, just two women who had both loved the same man, each in their own lonely way. She slid a folder across the table. "Everything I ever saved," she said. "Letters, photos, one recording. I didn't ask questions. Not yet." I just stared at her and asked the one thing I had carried like a thorn in my side since that cabin. "Did he love you?" Danielle looked out the window. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Yes, but not in the way you think, and not without guilt." I stared at Danielle as she spoke, her voice steady like someone who had told this story to herself 1,000 times in the dark, but never out loud. She told me they'd met before I even knew Rick existed, in a city he'd passed through, during a contracting job. She'd been young, struggling, with no family to lean on. He helped her fix a broken sink. That was all, at first. But then he came back, again and again, until it wasn't just a passing kindness, until it became something more. She didn't know he was married, not at first, and when she found out, she said, she tried to end it, packed up, moved across the state, didn't tell him about the baby, until Elliot was almost 4. "I didn't want anything from him," she said. "Not money, not promises, just truth. For the boy, not for me." But Rick had insisted. He started writing, visiting, quietly, sometimes once a month, sometimes less. "He said he loved us," Danielle whispered, "but it was a different kind of love. Complicated, conditional, like he was trying to make up for something he didn't have a name for." My hands curled around the edges of the folder. "And what about us?" I asked. "Me, our marriage. Did he ever say anything about the life we shared?" Danielle looked down into her coffee, like the answer might be at the bottom of the mug. Then she nodded. "All the time. He called you his anchor. Said you were the only reason he didn't disappear completely." I felt something inside me splinter. Not quite pain, not quite relief, just sharp and hollow. "But he still lied." "Yes," she said. "He lied to both of us, just differently." I left the cafe with the folder pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I didn't drive to the cabin or throw the box in the river. I went home, slowly, quietly, and I listened to the recording. Rick's voice, soft and measured, filled the room like a ghost. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. I wanted to be more. For you. For both of you. But I didn't know how to stop being to people. I didn't know how to choose." I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same one where he used to peel apples and tell me about his day. And I realized something that stopped my breath cold. He hadn't just lied to me. He'd robbed me of the chance to make my own decision. He'd written my story for me. Decided what I could handle. Decided what I should never know. And that more than the affair, more than the sun, more than the secrets is what shattered me. Because if he could hide a life from me for over 40 years, how much of the life we shared was even real? Margaret thought she was chasing a man's secret, but what she found was a life she was never invited into. A child, a second love, and a voice from beyond the grave that tried to explain it all too late. But some truths don't come with closure. Some just sit with you, whispering through the walls of the home you thought you knew. Part 3. I wanted to forget. But then he found me first. For 2 weeks I didn't open the curtains. I didn't return Danielle's calls. I left the box untouched, the recordings unplayed, the folder stacked neatly with the rest of Rick's old files on the hall table, like none of it mattered anymore, like I could somehow bury it again just by ignoring the sound of it breathing under my roof. But I couldn't unhear his voice. That tape, those words, the way he said my name like it still belonged to him. I wanted to believe I could grieve the man I thought I married and move on. That I could clean out the garage, donate the letters, and find a way to live with the silence he left behind. But that's not how grief works. And that's not how truth stays buried. The knock on the door came on a rainy Sunday morning. I remember because I hadn't brushed my hair, and I was still in Rick's old flannel shirt, the one he used to wear when he barbecued in summer. I almost didn't answer it. I almost let them walk away. But something made me open the door. A presence, a feeling, a quiet tension in the air like thunder that hasn't struck yet. And there he was, standing in the doorway, tall, mid-30s, hair like Rick's, eyes like mine. He didn't have to say his name. I knew. Elliot. The son I never knew existed. The man who now stood on my porch holding nothing but a soaked jacket and a cardboard envelope. He looked at me like I was a stranger, but also like someone he'd spent years imagining. I didn't say his name. I couldn't. My voice caught before it ever left my throat. But he spoke first. Calm, tired, almost rehearsed. I didn't come to blame you. Or him. I just wanted to see who he really was to you. I stepped aside, and he walked in like he belonged there. And maybe, in some strange way, he did. He stood in my living room like he had every right to be there. But I could see it in his shoulders. The weight, the doubt, the years of not knowing what to believe. He didn't sit at first. Just looked around the house like he was trying to recognize the version of his father that lived here. As if the walls, or the photos, or the furniture might whisper something his letters never told him. I watched his eyes land on Rick's old recliner, the one he never let anyone else sit in. And for a second I thought Elliot might cry. But he didn't. He just asked, softly, "Did he really live here? His whole life?" I nodded. 43 years. Bought it before we got married. Said he wanted a place that would never move. Elliot looked down at the envelope in his hands and smiled bitterly. Yeah. Sounds like him. Solid on the outside, shifting everywhere underneath. I didn't know what to say to that. So I offered him tea, the same way I would have offered it to a stranger, because that's what he still was to me. He sat at the kitchen table where I'd grieved, where I'd sorted through the lies, where I'd built a version of Rick that didn't exist anymore. I brought over the tea and chipped mugs, and we sat in silence while the rain ticked against the windows. Finally, he slid the envelope toward me. He wrote this 2 months before he died. Never sent it. I found it tucked behind the drawer, in the cabin after the funeral. I don't know why I kept it this long. Maybe I was waiting to stop being angry. Or maybe I was hoping you'd find me first. My fingers brushed the paper, but I didn't open it. Not yet. I looked at him, really looked, and saw Rick's jaw, my brother's eyebrows, something in the shape of his hands that made my chest ache. "Do you hate him?" I asked. He leaned back, arms crossed tight. I did. For a long time. I hated that he chose a life where I was a secret. I hated that I had to lie about who my father was every time someone at school asked. I hated that he showed up for birthdays but not court dates. That he called me son but never let me say it in public. And then I hated myself for still wanting to make him proud. His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away. But I don't hate you, he said. You didn't know. No, I said. I didn't. And I don't know what hurts more. That he lied to me, or that he trusted you with more of his truth than he ever gave me. Elliot nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for me to say that. That's why I came. Not to point fingers. I want to understand how he lived here like this. With you. With all of this. And never slipped. I opened the envelope. Not the letter yet. Just the flap. The weight of what was inside felt heavier than it should have. Like paper soaked. In memory. I didn't read it then. I just pressed it flat against the table and said the thing I hadn't dared speak out loud until now. Maybe he didn't slip. Maybe he wanted us to find each other. After I finally opened the letter that night, after Elliot left, I waited until the house was quiet again, until the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle against the roof and the hallway light cast long shadows across the floor. I sat where Rick used to read the newspaper, the cushions still shaped like him after all this time, and unfolded the pages with shaking hands. His handwriting hadn't changed. That same precise slant, the same slightly faded ink like he never could quite bring himself to press down to hard. The letter wasn't addressed to me or Elliot. It had no greeting, no date. It just began mid-thought, like he'd been talking to himself and finally decided to write it down. He wrote about guilt, about fear, about how he'd convinced himself for years that silence was the best form of protection, that by keeping us apart, he was sparing both families from pain. He said he told himself he was building walls to protect us, but he started realizing near the end that the walls had only made us strangers. There's no right way to live two lives, he wrote, only a wrong way to end one. That line stayed with me. I read it 3 times. Then I flipped the page. He wrote about Elliot, that he'd watched him from a distance, sent birthday gifts under fake names, once even sat in the back row of his high school graduation just to see him walk. And then he wrote about me. He said he loved me every day, that our life together wasn't fake, that he had never laughed harder or felt more peace than the nights we danced barefoot in the kitchen, that I was the only person who ever made him feel safe, but that he'd never forgiven himself for what he did before he met me, and never found the courage to tell me after. I wanted to be whole for you, he wrote, but I gave pieces of myself away long before you knew me. I just didn't know how to ask for them back. I put the letter down and stared at the window for a long time. I didn't cry. Not this time. The sadness had become something quieter, like an ache too deep to reach. Rick had written this letter for himself. Not for us. Not to repair. Just to confess. A truth sealed in an envelope he never mailed. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was afraid it would all fall apart. And maybe that's exactly what he deserved. But that didn't make the truth any less real. I sat in the dark and listened to the silence of a house I suddenly wasn't sure belonged to me anymore. And I realized something I hadn't let myself say out loud. I didn't know the man I married. Not completely. But I knew the man who made me laugh. I knew the man who held my hand through 3 miscarriages and still called me beautiful every morning. I knew the man who painted the bathroom pink just because I said I liked the color once in a magazine. And maybe that's the worst part. That both versions of him were real, just never in the same room at the same time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen until the sky turned pale. The letter still open on the table. Rick's words staring back at me like a question I was too tired to answer. By the time morning came, I had made a decision. I pulled out an old photo album from the hall closet, one I hadn't touched in years. I flipped through page after page of birthdays, vacations, hospital bracelets, holiday dinners, moments that once felt permanent. Then I made space, right in the middle of our life together. I slipped in a copy of Elliot's birth certificate, a picture of him standing in the rain on my porch. The letter Rick never sent. I wasn't rewriting history. I was finishing it. Later that afternoon, I called Danielle. I asked her to come by. Not for closure, not for answers, just to sit, to let the past breathe. And she did. She brought a box of things Elliot had saved. Old baseball jerseys, a drawing Rick had mailed him when he was 6, a broken watch with Rick's initials scratched inside. We laid everything out on the dining table and said nothing. We didn't need to. The silence was finally honest. That evening, Elliot came by again. I made soup. We sat outside on the porch with 3 mismatched bowls and listened to the cicadas hum in the trees. He asked me what Rick was like when I first met him. I told him about the way Rick used to dance in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching. The way he'd hum off-key. The way he hated cucumbers. The way he always warmed my side of the bed in winter before I came upstairs. Elliot smiled and said quietly, he never hummed around me. And I realized then that I hadn't been replaced. I'd just been separated. One life split down the middle, to halves that never got to meet. Until now, I don't know what happens next. I don't know if we'll ever be a real family. But I do know this. Secrets have a way of surviving us. And sometimes, the only way to break them is to bring them out into the open and let them speak. Rick never did that. But I can. Margaret thought. The story ended with a lie. But it didn't. Because the real ending was never his to write. It's hers. And now, for the first time, the people he kept apart are finally sitting at the same table. No more shadows. No more silence. Just truth. Raw, unfinished, and shared. Part 4. The photo wasn't just a memory. It was a warning. I thought we'd reached the end of it. That whatever Rick had hidden was finally out in the open. Unpacked and processed like old boxes in an attic. But I was wrong. It didn't end when Elliot showed up. It didn't end with the letters, or the recording, or even the tears on my kitchen floor. It ended with a photograph. A single photo tucked behind a loose panel in Rick's desk drawer. A place I'd cleaned out twice already. Or so I thought. I found it by accident. The panel popped when I dropped my keys to hard. Just a soft creak, like the house itself was exhaling. Inside was a plastic sleeve, aged at the edges, with a photo of Rick, much younger, maybe in his 30s, standing outside a rusted trailer. A woman was beside him, but it wasn't Danielle. And it sure as hell wasn't me. She was tall, long red hair tied in a knot, and holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. On the back, scribbled in sharp black ink, "Don't come looking for us again." That's all. No date, no name, no explanation. Just a snapshot of a man I thought I knew with strangers I'd never seen. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at it for almost an hour, my thoughts looping like static. Who was she? Why did she leave? And what did Rick do that made her write that? That night, I didn't tell Elliot. I didn't call Danielle. I didn't even put the photo on the table, like I had with everything else. I hid it, like Rick had. Not out of shame, out of fear. Because suddenly, it felt like we weren't unearthing his secrets. We were stepping into something still alive. And whoever that woman was, she didn't want to be found. I didn't sleep that night. The photo stayed on my nightstand, face down, as if flipping it over might somehow stop the questions from crawling into my head. But they did anyway. I kept picturing that woman's face, not angry, not scared, just resigned, like someone who'd seen this play out before and already knew how it would end. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had to be from before me, before Daniel, maybe even before he settled in Wakefield Ridge. But then I looked at the corner of the photo again. Behind Rick's shoulder, almost out of frame, was a pickup truck, newer model, and on the window was a decal, a local contractor's logo Rick only started using in the early 2000s. My heart dropped. This wasn't ancient history. This was recent. Maybe even after Elliot was grown. Maybe while I was still bringing Rick coffee in bed and marking our anniversary on the kitchen calendar. Like it meant something. I didn't know what scared me more. That he had another child. Or that there was an entire thread of his life running parallel to mine. That he never even hinted at. The note on the back didn't read like a breakup. It read like a warning. I sat in my robe on the end of the bed, staring at the wall, thinking about all the years Rick would disappear for supply runs or contracting trips. That never added up. Thinking about how his mood would shift out of nowhere, go dark, withdrawn, and then bounce back like nothing happened. And how I always assumed it was just stress, or age, or grief from the things he never talked about. But what if it was none of those things? What if he was protecting something, or someone, from me? Around noon I drove back to the cabin. I hadn't planned to. I hadn't even packed. I just grabbed the keys and the photo and left. The road was quiet. The woods felt different this time, heavier somehow. When I pulled up, I didn't unlock the door right away. I walked around the back, past the rusted toolshed, down to the old propane tank. I scanned the tree line, and that's when I saw it. A second trail, narrow, overgrown, half buried under leaves and time. It didn't match the one Rick and I used for firewood runs. This one snaked behind the cabin and disappeared into a small ravine. I should have gone home. I should have called someone, but I didn't. I followed the trail. The path was uneven, roots jutting up like bones through the dirt, branches clawing at my sleeves as if trying to pull me back. It twisted deeper into the woods than I expected, curving behind a thicket I'd never noticed before, until I reached a small clearing. There, half sunken into the hillside and masked by overgrown brush, stood what looked like an old storm shelter, concrete, rusted hinges, and a faded wooden door barely visible beneath. Ivy and years of moss. My breath caught. It didn't look like it had been touched in a long time, but something about it felt lived in. I stood there for a minute, not moving, just listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just the sound of my own breath getting thinner by the second. I took a step closer. The padlock on the shelter's door was old, but not broken. It had been placed there deliberately, and recently, and scratched faintly into the side of the door, as if carved in haste. Was something I didn't understand until I ran my fingers over it. It was a name, a woman's name, but not mine, not Danielle's. It was Lena. Underneath, a second word, smaller, less careful. No, that's all. Just Lena, and no. My stomach twisted. I tried the padlock, but of course it didn't budge. I stepped back and took a picture with my phone, my hands trembling, then left the clearing as fast as I could without outright running. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the doors. I sat in the center of the living room with the photo in one hand and my phone in the other, zooming in on the image I'd just taken, trying to make sense of what I'd found. And that's when I realized, in the original photo of Rick and the red-haired woman, the boy in the picture, he wasn't 5, not even close. He was maybe 8, and he was standing in front of that same shelter, same door, same trees. In the background, the timeline didn't make sense anymore. This wasn't before me. This wasn't even a double life. This was something else, something worse. And suddenly I understood what that scrawled warning meant. Don't come looking for us again. It wasn't about Rick being unfaithful. It was about danger, real danger. And someone had gone to a lot of trouble to disappear, which meant they had a reason. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. I kept the photo locked in my desk drawer, and the image of that hidden shelter burned into my mind. Every creak of the house made me sit upright. Every car that passed outside had me reaching for the curtain. I stopped answering calls, even from Elliot, even from Danielle, because this wasn't about them anymore. This was something older. Something Rick buried so deep that even after death it was trying to claw its way to the surface. On the 3rd morning, I went to the county clerk's office. Said I was researching land use around Wakefield Ridge for an inheritance matter. I don't know why I lied. Habit, maybe. Or fear that even now, someone might be listening. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes and no sense of suspicion, brought me a stack of dusty records from the early 2000s. Tucked in one file was a lease agreement. Rick's name, signed in 2003, but not for the cabin, for a trailer lot 2 counties over. The signature next to his was someone named Lena Parkhurst. My hands went cold. I asked if they had anything more on Lena. A forwarding address, a death certificate, anything. The clerk shook his head. She never renewed the lease, just disappeared, like she was never there. I didn't eat that night, just drove back home, sat in Rick's old chair, and stared at the fireplace like it might speak. At some point, I pulled out the photo again, and this time, I noticed something new. In the boy's hand, something metallic, small, reflective. I scanned the photo under the lamp, angled it just right. A locket, oval, hanging from a chain. The kind mothers used to put baby pictures in. My chest tightened. I knew that locket. I had it. I had it in a box of Rick's things I'd gathered after the funeral. One of the few personal items I hadn't opened yet. I raced to the closet, pulled the box out, and dumped it on the floor. Socks, coins, old receipts, and at the very bottom, that same locket, cold in my palm. It clicked open with a soft snap. Inside, 2 photos. One, a baby, swaddled, sleeping. No name, no date. The other, a woman with red hair, and on the back, scratched faintly into the metal. You said he'd be safe. I sat there on the floor, holding that locket, and I finally let myself feel the full weight of it. Rick didn't just lie. He didn't just keep a second life. He made a promise to someone who trusted him with everything. And he broke it. And whoever Lena was, wherever she had gone, she had done it not to hide from the world, but to hide from him, or from something he had become. And maybe I didn't know the man I married. Not truly. But now I knew the one thing he'd feared most. That one day, I'd start pulling on the wrong thread. That I'd follow the wrong trail. That I'd find the one thing even he couldn't bury. And I had. She thought. She was unearthing memories. But Margaret just pulled the first bone from a long-buried skeleton. A name, a shelter, a photo, a locket, and a promise someone made, then shattered. What Rick was protecting wasn't just a second family. It might have been a secret worth running from. Part 5. I went back to the cabin. This time, I brought a shovel. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Elliot. Not Danielle. I didn't leave a note or turn on my location. It wasn't reckless. It was intentional. Because if Rick had spent years hiding something, then I needed at least one day to look for it without someone trying to stop me. I left at dawn, dressed in layers, brought a flashlight, gloves, and the locket, and a shovel. The trail was easier to find now, almost like the forest remembered me. I followed it back to the shelter, the air thick with that stillness only deep woods can carry. The padlock was still there, but the door had shifted, just slightly. I hadn't noticed it before. A faint gap near the hinge, just wide enough to let in water, or let something out. I pried it open with a rusted tire iron Rick kept in the trunk of his old Jeep. It took 15 minutes, a lot of sweat, and one nasty bruise. But when the lock finally snapped and the door creaked open, the smell hit me first. Not decay, but time. Damp earth, metal, dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. I shined the flashlight down the short concrete stairwell. 10 steps, then a door. I almost turned back, but I didn't. At the bottom was a small room, maybe 10 by 10, built into the earth, walls lined with insulation and plastic sheeting, like someone had tried to soundproof it. On the far wall, shelves, labeled boxes, notes, a filing cabinet, and in the center, a child's chair, plastic, blue, with a name sticker. On the back, Jonah. I don't remember walking toward it. My hands moved on their own, lifting box lids, flipping through pages, old report cards, drawings, medical records, some in Rick's handwriting, others typed, many with names blacked out. One folder held a birth certificate, Jonah Parkhurst, mother, Lena Parkhurst, father, not listed. I sat on the floor, surrounded by evidence of a life no one was supposed to find. But it was what I found last that broke me. A letter, folded in half, tucked in the back of the cabinet. On the outside, in Rick's handwriting, in case she ever finds this. And inside, a message meant for me. A confession that would finally explain what happened, or destroy what little was left of the truth. I opened the letter slowly, my fingers barely able to pull apart the folds without shaking. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, typed on Rick's old typewriter, the one he claimed hadn't worked since 1998. The ink was faint in places, but every word hit like a hammer. If you're reading this, then I know what you found, and I'm sorry, not for the secrets, but for making you part of them. That was the first line. Then it shifted. He wrote about Lena, said they met in 1996 on a project out west. She was quiet, brilliant, and alone with a little boy named Jonah. Rick never explained what drew him in, only that he knew instantly. Jonah wasn't just some stranger's child. He didn't say the word son right away. He danced around it. He reminded me of someone I thought I could have been if I hadn't ruined everything. That was how he put it. At first he said he helped Lena out of guilt, helped her find housing, bought groceries, set up the trailer in her name. But then he started going back, months at a time, said he loved us, but couldn't unlove them, that the guilt was too loud, and the truth too tangled. And then came the part That stopped my breath. In 2004, he wrote, Lena came to me shaking. She said someone had been watching the trailer. That Jonah had found something strange in the woods. An old cassette player, left running near the window. She begged me to help them disappear, and I did. I gave them new IDs, drove them across 3 states, hid them with a contact I never told you about. He paused the narrative there, a line of like he was buying time. But I couldn't stay away. I told her I'd leave you. She said no, that I wasn't who I thought I was, that I'd already made my choice when I let silence become habit. She took Jonah and vanished. Again. Only this time, she didn't tell me where. The last paragraph was short. I built the shelter for them, in case they ever came back. Stocked it. Waited. But they never did. If you're reading this, Margaret, don't follow the trail. Let them be gone. Let my mistake die with me. Don't try to fix what I broke. I sat on the concrete floor, tears drying before they even reached my chin. I didn't feel anger or betrayal. I felt something worse. Helplessness. The kind that comes when you realize you were never part of the story at all. Just a placeholder. A warm body in the right place while the real drama unfolded somewhere else. But I wasn't going to let it end that way. Not anymore. I left the shelter just after sunset. The letter folded tightly in my pocket, the air heavier now with the weight of what I knew. I didn't bother locking it back up. There was nothing left to protect, and no one left to protect it from. The forest didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt tired, like a witness finally allowed to exhale. I drove home in silence, the headlights carving long shadows through the trees, Rick's voice still echoing in my head. Don't follow the trail. But I had. And now I had to decide what to do with what I'd found. For 2 days I didn't speak to anyone, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't trust myself to say anything without crumbling. I laid everything out on the dining table again. The photos, the locket, the letter, a map with the shelter marked in red ink. I stared at it like it might rearrange itself into something easier. It didn't. On the 3rd day, Elliot came by. He didn't knock, just stepped inside and stood there, his eyes scanning the table. You found more, didn't you? I nodded. Then, I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, twice. When he finished, he didn't speak, just looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. He didn't deserve you, he said finally, but I'm glad you found the truth, even if it hurt. That night, we burned the letter, together, not out of spite, not even out of shame, but because it wasn't mine to keep, and neither of us needed to carry Rick's words any longer. I kept the photo, though, the one of Lena and Jonah. I framed it, hung it in the back hallway, a place few people ever go, but one I pass every day, not as a shrine, as a reminder that love built on silence is no love at all. That truth, no matter how late it arrives, still matters, and that sometimes the most honest thing you can do for someone who lied to you is to stop lying to yourself. I never found Lena. I never looked for Jonah again. Maybe they're still out there, living quiet lives somewhere far from all this. Or maybe they've vanished for good. But if they ever do come back, if someday a stranger knocks on my door, with red hair and tired eyes and a locket around his neck, I'll open the door. I'll say his name, and I won't ask for anything in return, because I'm done chasing ghosts. I've made peace with the truth. And now, I finally know who I am without him. Thanks for watching my original story. If you enjoyed it, Don't forget to subscribe for more fictional narratives written and produced by me.